Greetings to all the viewers of the Open Studio. My name is Serge Dukhanov, and today it is my honor and pleasure to present to you Mr. Paul Craig Roberts, an American statesman, thinker, economist, researcher, and journalist whose writings, pronouncements, and way of thinking do stand out on the backdrop of the contemporary experts community. Mr. Roberts, good morning and welcome.
Good morning.
Sir, as we speak, officials and agencies of our two respective countries are busy preparing the summit between Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden. What is your assessment of the stage of the relations between the two countries, and what are your expectations of the future summit lest it happen?
As I will be critical of the Kremlin's negotiating strategy, I would first make it clear that President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov deserve credit for their persistence in trying to negotiate normal diplomatic relationship with Washington. The question is, when do their efforts become counterproductive? The situation is discouraging because Washington has more interest in bad relations with Russia than Washington has in having good relations with Russia. Washington needs Russia as an enemy in order to justify the enormous budget and power of the U.S. military security complex. We're talking about an annual budget of $1,000 billion and all the power that goes with that. So Russia is essential to maintaining that posture. It's also the fact that without the Russian threat, the United States hasn't the argument for imposing its will on Russia in order to maintain the unipolar state. Washington regards Russia as a constraint on American hegemony, which includes Washington's control over Europe. So you have two fundamental reasons that Washington has no interest whatsoever in normal diplomatic relations. Well, in other words, the high level of tension between the two countries works to Washington's advantage. Now, the Kremlin should keep in mind that President Trump was removed from office precisely because he wanted to normalize relations with Russia. The Russiagate hoax, the purpose of it was to keep Trump from improving relations. So when that hoax failed, they then resorted to impeachment on false grounds. And when that failed, then the election was stolen from Trump in order to remove him from office, in order to remove any prospect of better relations with Russia. So how can the Kremlin expect any success from a so-called summit meeting with Biden? Obviously, Biden is not going to negotiate away the Russian threat. If the American establishment removes one president from office for simply wanting normal relations with Russia, they're not going to let Biden achieve what they wouldn't let Trump achieve. So the Kremlin really should be aware that a meeting between Putin and Biden could just be a propaganda trap for Putin. There's a danger that Biden will say the talks could not succeed because Putin was unreasonable. Putin would not agree to stop poisoning people. He wouldn't agree to stop invading other countries. He wouldn't agree to stop engaging in cyber attacks on the United States. In other words, Washington's interest in the talks is probably just to make propaganda out of the failure of the talks, which will be used again to make the point that Russia is a troublemaker. So we can see already from the meeting recently between Lavrov and the American Secretary of State, sort of trying to prepare the grounds for the summit. Well, according to news reports, what did they talk about? They talked about the imprisonment of Navalny. They talked about Russia has to give Crimea back to Ukraine. They talked about Russian cyber attacks on the West. In other words, the same accusations against Russia as always. So how do you have a summit which consists of Putin sitting there listening to accusations from Biden? So if Putin doesn't say, oh, yes, we'll turn Navalny loose. Oh, yes, we'll give Crimea back to Ukraine. Oh, yes, we won't do any cyber attacks. Unless he takes that position, then he's going to be presented as being in the wrong. Well, how can he take these positions? He really can't and represent Russia. So essentially, it seems to me that this will be nothing but a propaganda trap for the Kremlin, that they'll walk into a trap, and then the news reports will be another failed effort because of Putin's aggressiveness and unreasonableness. So what could be done? There's really only two things that could remove the high level of tension. Washington could accept a multipolar world and stop insisting on its hegemony. This would diffuse the situation. If Washington simply said, hey, we give up our claim to be the arbiter of every other country's foreign policy, and we realize they have their own interests, and we'll try to adjust ours to accommodate theirs. Well, that would be a great success. But is Washington going to do that? There's no sign. There's no sign that Washington is willing to give up its hegemony or its attempted exercise of hegemony. The only other way is for Russia to give up some of its sovereignty and accept Washington's leadership like Germany, France, and England. Now, how can Putin give up Russian sovereignty and accept American leadership? He can't and remain in office, or he can't and have Russia have any sort of independence or influence. So on what basis can we look to there being any success from the summit? The demands that the Americans will make of Russia cannot be accepted by Russia. And as I have emphasized, Russia's value to Washington is to be the enemy because it justifies the foreign policy. It justifies the enormous military security complex budget. And you have to understand the political power and influence of the military security complex. It's far more powerful than the president. So what is the summit about?
Mm-hmm. Sir, you said that the United States wants, or Washington wants, Russia to be its enemy. Then to what degree? Is the nuclear war excluded? Is it only just regional conflicts like Syria, Ukraine, or something else? But Ukraine is much closer to the Russian borders than Syria. Maybe. Mhm.
That's a very good question. Of course, that's the danger of the high level of tensions. The danger is nuclear war.
Mhm.
It's also the danger of the Kremlin uh, showing forever a willingness to negotiate. For example, Putin announced that the fact that Biden called him a killer, a man without a soul, does not mean he won't negotiate with Biden. Well, if you continue in that mode, it becomes counterproductive at some point because Washington says, well, we can do whatever we want. Putin accepts it.
Mhm.
We can call him a killer without soul and he'll still come talk to us. So what else can we do? We can overthrow Belarus, or as the European Parliament voted this week, um, to support regime change in Russia. So here's, after all the diplomatic efforts of Putin and Lavrov with Europe, all their meetings with Merkel, with Macron, and what do we have? The European Parliament just voted to have regime change in Russia. Well, this shows an attitude that simply is unaccepted of good relations with Russia. So if you have this type of attitude and there's no real penalty from the Russian side, then the West may get more aggressive. At some point, it may push so far that the Kremlin has to respond. And so I don't think the Americans want a nuclear war. Washington doesn't want a nuclear war. But if you get a situation where there's going to be a response, the war will be nuclear because the United States has no conventional capability of engaging the Russian military on conventional grounds. It couldn't engage China on conventional grounds. The United States would be forced to use nuclear weapons. So any kind of conflict between the United States and Russia would be nuclear. It would be essentially the end of the world. And so this is why I say that Putin and Lavrov deserve respect for trying to normalize relations. And the only question is, when do their efforts become counterproductive? If they show such acceptance of insults and provocations, you have to expect that they will get worse. And when they get worse, at some point, a line gets crossed and there has to be a response. So I think the United States doesn't really want conflict. It doesn't want a war. It doesn't want a regional war, but it wants the prospect of enemies because that justifies the budget that flows into the military security complex. That money, part of it, comes back in political contributions to elect the members of the House, the members of the Senate, and the president. In other words, if the American taxpayer is funneling $1,000 billion annually into the defense sector, then those firms use some of that money to support the political campaigns of the members of the House, the members of the Senate, and the candidates for president. So essentially, the military security complex owns the government. And it mainly just wants to keep that money flow going, to keep the profits going. It doesn't really want a war,
Mhm.
but it wants the enemy because that keeps the money flowing. It keeps their influence alive. And so the war would be from the Americans pushing too far, or it would be from false alarms. You see, this is perhaps the real danger. You know, during the Cold War in the 20th century, there were numerous failures of the warning systems, both on the Soviet side and the American side. There would be reports of incoming enemy ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, but they were not believed. Why? Because the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the President of the United States were working together to reduce tensions. And everyone knew this. So people would say, well, we're having success. Look at all the arms control agreements. We speak to each other politely. We don't call each other names. This must be some mistake in the alarm system. So the reduction of the tensions of the Cold War in the 20th century meant that people would say, well, this has to be a mistake. And instead of sending the message, oh, we're being attacked, so that somebody would push a button. But now, with the tension so high, both sides are likely to believe a false alarm. And this is the danger. There's no trust.
Mm-hmm.
And when there's no trust, a false alarm is a far more serious thing when there is trust and people are working to diffuse the situation. You know, the Cuban Missile Crisis woke up President Kennedy, it woke up Khrushchev, and they saw, whew, we came very close to mutual destruction. We've got to do something about this. And so beginning with that, we had every American president, all the Soviet governments working to put tensions to bed. We had the SALT I treaty under Nixon, the SALT II treaty. We had the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and so on and so on and so on. And finally, we had Reagan and Gorbachev ending the Cold War. So this type of success has now been overturned in the 21st century due to the collapse of Soviet communism, which put Yeltsin in power, who in effect became an American puppet. And this reignited the American belief in their exceptional nature, their right for to use hegemony over other countries. And so we had the period of the 90s with the United States, the unipower, Russia, a subservient country. And it was only the reestablishment of Russian independence with Putin that we saw again an independent Russia. Well, this greatly annoys the American foreign policy community. And so there is an inbred hostility to Russia because it's a constraint on American hegemony. And that is really a huge barrier to normal relations.
Sir, from what you say, would it be correct to suggest that, say, we need a two or maybe three-pronged strategy or a balancing act of sort? Say, first, the Russian side has inevitably to show some firmness. Second, we must remember the old days when two countries, the leadership of the two countries, had this habit of agreeing to disagree. And then we have to somehow elevate the level of trust, at least between the two militaries.
Yes, those are the things that need to be done. perhaps the best way for the Kremlin to proceed would simply be to ignore the West. Don't reply to the accusations. You know, the Russian woman who is the spokesperson for the foreign ministry, she's very good, and she refutes the lies and so on. But why bother? Yes, she's very good. But why bother to refute the lies? Why acknowledge them? They simply should ignore the accusations. They should focus on stabilizing the former Soviet and former Russian provinces that are now independent in order to protect them from American overthrow, like Ukraine. Ukraine was overthrown by the Americans, Georgia. So the Russians should focus their diplomacy on stabilizing the former parts of the Russian and Soviet empire to make them immune to American meddling. This should be their main foreign policy focus, along with the best possible relations with China. Because if there was some unity between Russia and China, some treaty, some mutual defense treaty, that would stop the provocations, because there's no prospect of the United States or NATO going into conflict with Russia and China. In fact, that type of relationship could be extended to Iran, to Syria. It would very quickly stop all of the trouble, because the West would be faced with overwhelming force if it pursued the type of policy they follow in Washington. So that would be the way to proceed for the Kremlin, just to say, look, we're here. If you want to do business with us, that's fine. If you need our energy, that's fine. We won't withhold it from you. If you want to do business with us, you're welcome. But we don't need you. And we don't really even need embassies there, because we don't have normal relations. So why should we pretend and have ambassadors when all we get is insults? And just go about their business and focus on Asia. Focus on Eastern Europe. You know, a lot of the Eastern European countries, not a lot of them, but some of them, they've had enough of the EU. They realize that the European Union that they stupidly joined is against their national sovereignty and wants to fill them up with immigrant invaders from the third world. So, you know, the Russians should simply forget about the West, just not respond. And then that way, the propaganda has no effect. It just dies, it falls away. But when you have spokespersons and they answer the lies, that keeps them alive. It's kind of like if you accuse somebody of beating their wife, and he says, well, I don't beat my wife, then he's fallen into the trap. And so in many ways, Russia falls into the trap by answering the accusations. They should simply understand that that's the attitude of the West. It's not going to change because of any facts. It doesn't matter what facts the Russian foreign minister presents. Washington doesn't care what the facts are. At some point, the Kremlin has to understand that the facts don't matter to Washington. And therefore, to stop refuting accusations.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much for your insight. And we would like to wish you a good day today.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate the interview. And I hope that the relations between the countries can somehow become less dangerous. And that the Russian government at some point will conclude that its efforts might be counterproductive.
Let's hope.
Let's hope.
Thank you.